Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. Tonight is March the 16th, 2015. The show is being recorded on March the 15th, 2015. And, of course, bear that in mind as we discuss current events, as the events unfold in real time here. We're doing our best to keep up with them in real time. Tonight, I want to talk about a number of different subjects, but I don't know if we're going to be able to get all the way through them. I kind of want to focus on the political anarchy situation and try to explain some of this using a historical parallel, and why I believe that the idea of anarchist revolutionaries in the modern day world is unfortunately not the direction that we want to go in. Not saying that some of those individuals don't have legitimate philosophies or points to make, but in terms of what this type of cohesion, this not even really cohesion, but this type of social organization means for the rest of the world and for any kind of movement in general, I think we need to look at that in terms of its historical context, and if for no other reason than to see how that may affect us as activists, as researchers, as individuals who want to see the world improved in general. So we'll get into that, and if we have time, I want to get into the question of Syria and Iraq and the idea of so-called crimes against humanity that were allegedly committed by the Iraqi military, and of course we'll get into that if we have time. Now, just recently we had a couple events take place here in not here, but in next county over in Mullins, South Carolina, which is in Marion County. I'm in Florence County here, so it's just the next county over. And Mullins, a small town here in South Carolina, provided a venue for a number of talks. Has provided a venue for two of mine, and it's called Coffee, Etc. And these events hopefully will be up on YouTube soon enough. We've actually had two events that I helped organize, and we've got some video coming from those events that we'll try to put up on YouTube. And we had Eileen Powell discussing empowering yourself through natural health, and also discussing the immune system specifically, and those were very good talks as well. And we also had Dylan Shelton and Eric Metz of the Tax Wall Street Party, Wilmington, North Carolina branch, and they came in as well to talk about the Tax Wall Street Party platform, in other words, the American system of economics. And that's something that really needs to be taken a look at more closely. It's something that if you're a follower of Keynes, or if you're a follower of the Austrian school, I think then you're obviously heading in the two wrong directions. You should take a look at the American system, because it has a lot to offer, and we'll discuss that at some point as well. Very good talks, and it's an example of what you should be doing if you have the opportunity. This is the idea that if you're a speaker, then you should be out in your community speaking. If you're a writer, then you should be writing and doing whatever you can to bring this information about, and not just wake people up. This is not the this terminology that we use, but to sound cliche by now, but this is not a suggestion to just go out and spread information and the world will be saved by people spreading information. It won't be saved by people spreading information, but that is a major part of it. You've got to do what you can to let people know what is actually happening in the world, and what is actually behind the forces that guide their lives individually. But you also got to provide them solutions to what they can do about it, and what kind of demands they can make. And once you got the demands that you can make, then we can discuss about the methods by which we're going to demand them, right? Whether it's protest, whether it's a mass strike, whatever it is, these are things that need to be dealt with, and that's an important part. And you can start by doing something on your own. Whatever your talent is, you need to use that talent. And you also need to branch out beyond your comfort zone in order to do that sometimes. And sometimes you'll find out that you engage in these activities, and that maybe you're not very good at it. And then, well, okay, that's not a big deal. You know that you're not very good at it. and you move on, find something else you're good at. But a lot of times you get outside your comfort zone and you find out that you are actually good about it, good at doing what you attempted to do, and then that that's a very exciting thing to realize you have a talent that you didn't already have or didn't already realize that you have. So, and if you try something and you fail, it's no big deal. It's just a long life, and it's failing is part of the process. So nothing to worry about in that respect. But this is the idea. Again, you need to get involved. You need to go out and stop playing around on the internet constantly. There is a world outside of the internet. Go out to your community, whether it's a big city, whether it's Boston, New York, LA, or whether it's a small town, out in Iowa or South Dakota somewhere. You can have an effect. You can get involved, pass out flyers, pass out DVDs, give talks, write articles. I don't care what you do, as long as you're doing something, and it will have an effect. And if nothing else, you can attract other like-minded people. And when you attract other like-minded people, the meeting together of two forces can double the effect that only one person could have. So bear that in mind as well. Now, what I wanted to get into about tonight, I've been talking about this article for some time, and I wanted to finally get into it. It's called The Duping of Anarchist Revolutionaries, the Modern Anarchist Movement, and the Russian Revolution. This is something that is exclusive to BrandonTurbeville.com. And before I go into it, I guess I should plug the websites. If you're interested in my work, then you should go to BrandonTurbeville.com. You should go to activistpost.com if you want to follow my work as it comes out regularly. I also write occasionally for naturalblaze.com and the Anti-Media. But you can also hear this show every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv. And again, you can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Track. So make sure you do that. But if you want to follow my work specifically, then I definitely encourage you to go to BrandonTurbeville.com. That is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the interviews that I do, and all the archive versions of this show. And you'll also find a books tab where you can find all of my books that are available for sale. And you can find links to events that I will be participating in, and that will be posted up on the website as well. All the relevant information will be there at BrandonTurbeville.com. And of course, the article that I just mentioned, The Duping of Anarchist Revolutionaries, the Modern Anarchist Movement, and the Russian Revolution, that is exclusive to BrandonTurbeville.com. I'm sure other people have reposted it by now, but if you have a website and you're listening, feel free to repost in total if you like. But go check that article out. You can Google it, and it'll come up under my website. And I feel after we've just organized these events, it's important to discuss the idea, the makeup of any kind of movements. And again, I've said it on this show a number of times, right? I'm not anti-anarchist in a way. I'm not saying these things to provoke or insult my anarchist friends and compatriots here. But at some point we have to point out that the anarchist mode is counterproductive, right? And these people, whether they get out of the anarchist mode or not, if they will be willing to work with me, I'll be willing to work with them, and that's how we have to be here, right? We have common interests, we have to work together. But let's talk a little bit about the anarchist mode in general, so maybe we can get into that, and maybe we can expound upon this stuff sometime. So now whenever you have individuals or a group of individuals that are kind of confronted with the oppressive state apparatus, right? We all know what the oppressive state apparatus is. Whenever one's confronted with it, you have generally a couple of choices, right? You can either accept your subservience to that system and do nothing and just be a part of it. You can agitate for a change in that apparatus. You can become part of the apparatus. You can protest in the streets and demand new laws or repeal of old laws or that sort of thing. Or you can advocate for the abolition of the state altogether. In other words, just pull out of the system and say, just crash it. Now, the first choice that I mentioned, the idea of just accepting the plight, is just that's vile, right? That's not something that we're even going to address, because that's not something that we certainly support. And, you have the attempt to change the state apparatus into this, more suitable or beneficial institution. Those attempts are generally weak, they're tepid, they're insufficient in the way it's carried out by the people who are involved in the attempt to do so. And it's also very easily co-opted. But the attempt to remove all vestiges of order and any regulatory policy, that's a close second to the first choice that I mentioned, the idea of just accepting one's own slavery, right? Because in a sense that is defeatism, to say that, oh, we can't do anything about it, so let's just crash everything around us, and a lot of people will die in the process, but we'll be fine, so that's all that matters. Now, this is the ideology, unfortunately, that has become attractive to activists for decades, and it's one that's been easily co-opted. And we look at the people in other types of movements who want laws or want to repeal laws or whatever, and we see how closely and easily they are co-opted. But we also need to see how easily anarchists are co-opted as well. Anarchists have been used by the world oligarchy as battering rams and cannon fodder for ushering in its own agenda for generations and generations. And one of the examples in world history where we can use this, we can look at the use of anarchists by the world oligarchy, is the Russian Revolution, and of Kerensky, of Trotsky, of Lenin. Well, Lenin was, I guess you'd call that the Communist Revolution, is where it officially became the Communist Revolution, but it's one that really exemplifies the technique of using these dedicated, idealistic, anarchist young people, the anarchist youth, to act as the spearhead for a revolution that was not of their own making and was certainly not for their own benefit. It's an example of how these revolutions almost always lead to a situation that is worse, infinitely worse than what what they may have envisioned to begin with, regardless of their legitimate griefs. I mean, you can even look at Ukraine and see that situation now. Whatever Yanukovych was, he certainly wasn't as bad as what Ukraine has now, and that's just one example. But of course, that wasn't necessarily an anarchist color revolution. That was something that was based on Nazism and racism in Ukraine. So and just youthful discontent and all, and lots of different factors here. But let's not get taken away by that. The history of the 20th century anarchism in Russia might come as a surprise to many members of the anarchist movement of modern day, because a lot of these guys, what I find is that a lot of the people in the alternative media today, as it stands, will be completely surprised when anybody suggests that there is such a thing as a left-wing anarchist, because I've seen individuals get involved in arguments because someone called them a left-wing anarchist, and the response was the libertarian laugh, the ha-ha, you think that there's such a thing as a left-wing anarchist, that's a contradiction. Well, it's not a contradiction. The left was promoting anarchy before anarchy was ever cool. And if you look at modern anarchists, and most of them, and they mean very well. I've got a lot of friends who are anarchists, and this does not mean to insult them. A lot of them are my brothers. I will work with them at any opportunity. But a lot of people who consider themselves anarchists today in modern day are well-meaning, but they're deceived into fighting for the very same interest as Wall Street, as major corporations, and even, ironically, the government. Now, I'll give you an example. The argument against the ban on GMO food, or against the regulation of banks, or against social safety net protections, or pro-austerity arguments, arguments against the regulation of major corporations, all these arguments, those are the desires of major banks and corporations. But if these banks and corporations, who are generally hated amongst the public, even the dumbed-down, ridiculous public that we have today, they're still hated. Most people hate banks, for instance. And, so if these companies or banks came out and openly argued for some of their desires, the activist community, what little bit of it actually exists, might come to suspect these arguments, or might suspect these desires as the arguments is the right word, the arguments of deregulation or pro-austerity, they might suspect these arguments as what they truly are, right? They would look at it and see that a bank arguing for pro-austerity or a bank arguing for deregulation is clearly a bank trying to improve its own social standing in the world. It's trying to remove obstacles to its greater success. But if an anarchist activist does it, some person on the ground who has virtually no money and nowhere to stay, and they're out in the street arguing for deregulation and austerity, then it looks a little different. It looks rebellious, and it can attract the youth. And it makes sense on a very simplistic level. And that's how a lot of this stuff gains steam, because it's presented as rebellious, it's presented as anti-establishment, when in actuality it's being promoted by the establishment. So if you provide the cover of the idea of the free market, anarchist societies, community culture, all that kind of stuff, to the actual goals of the oligarchs, you create that revolutionary edge, and that produces nothing more than a Hunger Games society, but it has this revolutionary edge to get young people and activists involved. So we can't go through in this show a detailed study of all the instances where anarchy was used to achieve the goals of the world oligarchy, because that would be too detailed, that would take too long to do, and that would be a massive history lesson. But we can look at pretty much one example of that happening in one location during one point in history, right? And that is the anarchist movement in Russia. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the questions of anarchists and anarchy being used to usher in the agenda of the world oligarchy was the method that was used to usher in the communist revolution. Now, the presence of anarchist revolutionaries, they would come to be known as communists, but that existed a long time before the actual red banners flew over St. Petersburg. And the revolutionary terrorists, because that's what they were, had been organized under the communo-anarchist banner long before their successful assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1885. Now, again, you look at these anarchists, and I'm sure most of my listeners will know that when you say anarchists, you have anarcho-communists, anarcho-capitalists, anarcho-syndicalists. You have all these different branches of anarchy. But in the end, and both groups, anarcho-communists, anarcho-capitalists especially, will argue, well, these are two different things. You can't confuse the two. Well, I understand that there are some differences in the methods of presentation and maybe the methods of the goals of those groups at the ground level, but at the higher levels and at the level of implementation, it's the same thing. And it's the deal between saying it's the same deal as saying that Episcopalians and Protestants, they're very different. Well, not Protestants, I'm sorry, but Pentecostals are very different. Yeah, they're very different, but they're both Christians, right? And they both have a lot of the same base beliefs. And of course, at the end of the day, if you're going to impose a government based on Pentecostal views or Episcopalian views, you will still have a religious dictatorship, a theocracy. So at the end of the day, anarchists always end up with the same type of society, whether it's anarcho-communist or anarcho-capitalist. And they can argue over the details and the goals and the presentations all they want, but it's not really going to make that much of a difference in the end, because it's the same thing. In the end, it's the same thing. So again, back to Russia. The assassination of Alexander II would have been, could be seen as a clear example of how these so-called revolutionaries were not working for the benefit of the working class or the peasantry, as they had claimed, but they were working at the behest of the world oligarchy and the wealthy elites and the powers that were not necessarily even native to Russia. This is despite the fact that many of the Russian anarchists were convinced that they were fighting for a better world for the underclass. Now again, this applies to many of the lower level revolutionaries, but does not apply to all of those or any of those at the higher levels. I mean, we know that Russian communism was funded by, it came out of Britain. It came out of the British Foreign Office. and a number of secret societies as well. The Freemasons played a role in this situation, and this is well documented. But the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, I mean, this is the individual who freed the serfs, and he was paid back by being assassinated. So from the very beginning, and let's go back a little earlier, the anarcho-communists worked against the best wishes of the Russian people, right? Despite this rhetoric surrounding workers and peasants and liberation and liberalism and all that kind of stuff, the early communists, in the form of anarcho-communists, worked against the interests of the Russian people at every turn. Each time the Russian ruling class would make an overture toward greater rights for Russian peasants, the revolutionaries would be there to assassinate the initiators of the reforms. Anytime a government official bowed to public outcry and said, "Okay, we'll meet these demands," the Russian anarchists would be there to assassinate that person. Each time the Russian monarchy would move forward with an attempt to meet some of these levels of demands made by even the anarchists themselves, the revolutionary anarchists would step up the attacks against the monarchy, so they would stop any tangible change from ever taking place. There's a good book. It's Robert K. Massey. This is a mainstream book, and he doesn't go into a lot of the detail, the hidden detail. But the book was called God. Give me a second here. I'll pull up the book. It completely slipped my mind the name of the book. It's Nicholas and Alexandra. It's about a 600-page book, or it might even be longer than that. And it's written by Robert K. Massey of the Massey family. But in that book, Robert Massey, this is a quote. He says, "For Nicholas, the most dramatic proof of Podebnozev's teachings against the dangers of liberalism was the brutal assassination of his grandfather, Alexander II, the most liberal of Russia's 19th century czars. For his historic freeing of the serfs, Alexander II was known as the Tsar Liberator, yet his murder became the preeminent objective of Russian revolutionaries. The assassins went to extraordinary lengths." In other words, Nicholas, the last Russian Tsar, his grandfather was Tsar Alexander II, and Tsar Alexander II was the Tsar who was responsible for freeing the serfs, and that's why he was known as the Tsar Liberator. But for the fact that this man had liberated the serfs, he became the #1 target of assassination from the revolutionary anarchists, and we'll see why in a second. Now, the son of Alexander II, the last Tsar's father, Tsar Alexander III, was also targeted by these networks of anarchists and revolutionaries. And the Ulyanov family, if anybody remembers the Ulyanov family, that's Lenin's family. Vladimir Lenin had changed his name. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was his name, and he changed it to Lenin. The Ulyanov family was from the very beginning one of the prime actors in the attempt to kill Alexander III. So Lenin comes from a quote-unquote revolutionary family. So this runs deep in the blood of the Lenin line, right, the Ulyanov line. So there's something to this family that had been attempting revolution for generations, and that's very important, and you should definitely do research on that to find out what that really indicates. So the Lenin family, the Ulyanov family, was playing a major role in the attempt to impose so-called revolution on the Russian people. In 1887, Lenin's older brother, Alexander, who was Alexander Ulyanov, but Lenin's older brother, was arrested in St. Petersburg, along with 4 other university students, on the charge of trying to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. They had been arrested. They had this crude bomb. It wasn't going to work. It's kind of a dud, concealed, and they had this thing concealed inside a hollowed-out medical dictionary. And Alexander didn't deny the charge, and he was about to be assassinated. His mother had rushed to his side as he was being arrested, and he said, "I tried to kill the Tsar, the attempt failed, and that is all there is to it." That was his quote as he was being arrested and going to be executed, clearly. for the attempted assassination. Now, these so-called revolutionaries had succeeded in assassinating Alexander II in 1881 by means of a bomb. The organization that was responsible for that assassination was called the Narodная Volya. This was a revolutionary society that Lenin's older brother had been a part of. Narodная Volya itself had come from a group called Land and Liberty. So this is, again, we have Ulyanov family being the revolutionary family. This kind of runs in the blood of the Ulyanovs. But we also have these organizations, these revolutionary societies like Narodная Volya, the Land and Liberty societies. Narodная Volya means people's will in Russian, but again, these societies resemble the kind of Mazzini societies, the young societies, young Turks, young Russians, that sort of thing. Young Russians have made a comeback under Boris Nemtsov, who was recently killed in Russia, and that's interesting in itself, in his own right. So we have Nicholas II on the throne of the Anglo-American-backed revolution, having shifted its focus on killing him now. When Nicholas II takes over, we have the anarchist revolutionaries wanting to kill him, and there was this massive push for what amounted to a color revolution in earnest when Nicholas II took over. So in 1905, there was an attempt by the revolutionaries to organize a march on the Winter Palace, as well as an attempt to assassinate Nicholas II. The uprising came around the time of the Putilov workers' strike, which had actually arisen out of this mismanagement of the war that Russia had been involved in Japan. It was a stupid affair. It was an imperialist affair, and it was mismanaged all the way, and it created a situation in which there was a workers' strike. Now, for what the Tsar was not a humanitarian by any means, but while his version, the Tsarist Russia, was being painted as this iron-fisted dictatorship a la Saddam Hussein, a la Gaddafi, a la Bashar al-Assad, he was supposed to be this dictator over the working class and the average citizens. And American leaders were actually calling for violence against striking workers. So this guy was supposed to be an iron-fisted dictator. And the American leaders, the promoters of freedom and democracy, as always, are calling for violence against striking workers. Remember, the Pullman strike of 1894, we had William Howard Taft, who was a judge at the time, calling for killing the striking workers, and he called for the U.S. military to be involved. And again, in 1900, this is around the same time as this Putilov workers' strike. This is a couple of years before. We had Theodore Roosevelt calling for summary executions of striking workers. And in Russia, the Tsar is painted as this, very different from the ruling class of the United States and other industrialized nations. He's this iron-fisted dictator, but in the United States, they're calling for the very same thing, to killing striking workers and that sort of thing, who are fighting for basic working conditions, basic human rights. Now, like the target of virtually every Anglo-American, or like every target of the Anglo-American establishment, the Tsar was painted as this, again, brutal dictator that killed his own people, that crushed all dissent, and that claim could be true in a lot of cases. In fact, that did happen, right? There were a lot of clampdowns, there were a lot of killings. Let's not paint the Tsar out to be this angel of democracy and compassion. This was, again, a royal family. This was royal families are bred from the very beginning to not care about the affairs of the little people, right? The little people mean nothing to them, and this is psychopathic in nature. But so let's talk about this. The Tsar, again, painted as a killer of his own people, brutal dictator. But a lot of these claims are wildly exaggerated, and that they're repeated to overthrow the regime. And of course, that's not for the benefit of the citizenry. It is the benefit of the geopolitical interests of the world oligarchy. Now, Tsarism, it's autocratic. It's the rule of genetic royalty, and it was not only an oppressive system of government, but it was an insult to the collective worth of the Russian people, right? As all autocratic genetic royalty is. Despite the fact that the serfs had been freed, the Russian people en masse tended to live in poverty. It was grueling hard work. It was quiet desperation. The revolutionaries played on this resentment of many of these people and parties that were affected and who were angry, as well as the apathy of the vast amount of the population, the people who had just adapted, as the majority of the population always does in any point in history. And these revolutionaries, of course, had much worse plans for Russia and the Russian people in the very near future. Now let's talk about Stolypin. Stolypin is a very important part, and I'm getting to the point of this discussion. The revolutionaries and the anarchists at every turn managed to attack, to oppose, to assassinate the individuals in government who were working or achieving the greatest gains for reform for the Russian people. And this is an example, Peter Stolypin is a perfect example of this. Never once, well, I won't say never once, but the anarchists rarely attacked individuals who were extremely conservative and wanting to keep the monarchy, and you would assume that these were the individuals who were to be targeted the most if you were in the position of the anarchist. They would attack individuals who were actually bringing about some of the reforms that the anarchists were calling for. And the reason for this is they didn't want reforms to come from the government. They didn't want to improve the system, the plight of the Russian people. They wanted to seize power, and that was all that they were concerned with. The Russian people could go to hell. The Russian people could be damned. They didn't care. They were only concerned about assuming power, which is what they did. Now, throughout this so-called revolution, Stolypin was responsible for negotiating peaceful settlements to disputes between participants in uprisings, striking workers, individuals who were discontented and were taking a stand. He would negotiate peaceful settlements between these individuals and the government. And when he was put into power by the Tsar, it was his job to suppress the uprisings. But Stolypin didn't use the police or the military, right? He didn't come in with an iron fist and clamp down on people. He personally walked into the midst of what they called rebels, and he discussed the situation with them. And he would say, what is the problem here? Let's talk about how we can fix it. And most of the time, almost always, he persuaded the leaders of these uprisings to lay down their arms and agree to some terms, and he kept the Russian military at bay. And because of his success in these situations, Stolypin was made Prime Minister of Russia. And in that new position, Stolypin tried to address the root causes of the discontent that the Russian peasants were feeling. It was legitimate discontent, after all, and it was legitimate discontent that allowed those uprisings to occur and gave those communist, anarchist, and revolutionaries the ability to latch onto those issues and co-opt the energy of angry Russians so they could use them as cannon fodder in the Color Revolution. As Prime Minister, Stolypin first ordered the capture and hanging of assassins of government officials. So he wanted to crack down on the assassinations that were taking place on a regular basis, because the anarchist revolutionaries had really pulled out all the stops. They were killing government officials left and right, and Stolypin wanted to stop that. So what he found the individuals, the assassins who were guilty of this, he had them hung, and then he began to tackle the issues, the base issues that were facing the Russian people. And that's land ownership, that was farming, that was education, economics, of course, transportation, and of course freedom of religion and freedom of the press. Now, where we get to the interesting part, right? The farming conditions of Russian peasant farmers were what many people would consider to be an anarchist paradise, right? Despite the fact that technically the whole of Russian land, all of it, the whole country, was owned by genetic royalty. Most peasants were entirely agrarian, Most peasants had just kind of eked out their lives from the land. They lived in leaderless communes. They made communal decisions regarding the land, and they worked in coordination and partnership with each other. The problem was that method was incredibly inefficient. And within each commune, you had a single peasant that might farm about 50 small strips, and each of these small strips contained a few thin rows of corn or wheat. And the peasant who worked those rows would spend more time walking between these scattered furrows than he did plowing the earth or scything the grain. He was spending more time getting to the rows than he was actually working them. So Stolypin came in and realized how silly and inefficient this method is, and as an agent of the government, introduced the concept of private property to Russian society. So this might really not appeal to a lot of people here, but the idea was that they already lived in some form of the anarchist paradise in the commune, right? So there was the agent of the government that came in and introduced the concept of private property, and that's actually one of the details that the anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-communists would disagree on. But regardless, there we are. Now, Stolypin, by decree, declared that any Russian peasant who desired to do so could pull out of the communes and claim from that commune a share of land to farm for himself. Stolypin also declared that the land that the peasants claimed was to be in one piece, so not a bunch of crazy strips here, left, right, and center, but in one piece, so they could be passed on to their children. And then the Tsar comes in and orders 4 million acres of crown-owned land to be sold to the government, so the government could then sell them off to the peasant at easy terms. In other words, it's sort of a chicken in every pot method to encourage land ownership and sort of thing. Now, as a result of that, the agrarian life of the Russian peasant and the Russian peasant class in general was greatly improved, and the Russian economy improved. They introduced free education. They introduced the ending of the censorship of the press, and they introduced more and more religious tolerance. But it was Lenin and these groups of revolutionaries and anarchists that were staunch in their hatred of Stolypin. It wasn't the most conservative pro-monarchist wings of the Russian government. It was Stolypin who was bringing about these changes, and their hatred was based on the fact that any improvement in the condition of the Russian people reduced their ability to recruit cannon fodder for the color revolution and to play upon the will of the people for their cause. And this is what Massey says. He says, revolutionaries hated to see any amelioration of a system which bred discontent. For Lenin and his dwindling band of exiles, the Stolypin era was a time of fading hope, end quote, because it was getting better. So lifting the burden of discontent was studied because the revolutionary anarchist assassinated Stolypin. And it reminded us, in a way, of this assassination of Lincoln, because Stolypin had gone to an opera, and he got up during the intermission of the opera, and as he got up, there was an assassin that walked down the aisle, walked up to Stolypin, stood face to face with him, pulled out a Browning revolver, and shot him twice in the chest, and killed him. So while the leading Russian regime, of course, was corrupt, the Tsar was corrupt, it was autocratic, and yes, it was oppressive, it was at all times the individuals who were part of that regime that led the charge for reform who were targeted by the anarchists and the revolutionaries. So now let's move on and discuss how people are duped, right? You don't want to, in order to summarize, we can't summarize the history of Russia. It's too much. We can't even summarize the history of the communist revolution or the history of anarchism or go into color revolutions. I've done that a number of times on the show, or even mass movements, right? You can still see how movements largely seen as popular and organic by the public and the activist community can in reality be used to usher in a system that was not only worse than the one that it was supposed to replace, but one that's antithetical to human dignity and even the professed goals of the movement itself. In other words, how it can be either created from the very beginning or at least infiltrated and used to create something much worse than what the activists were fighting against. Now, again, I'm not trying to single out anarchists as the only possible dupes of mass social movements and false revolutions. Every division of political thought has seen members who become dupes of color revolutions, of co-opting, of false group consciousness, that sort of thing, groupthink. Within the alternative media, though, you have to look at today, in 2015, the alternative media and the modern kind of anarchist culture. Anarchy has become the probably most dominant ideology in the alternative media, which is why I'm discussing this today. Now, while a lot of members of the left who espouse Marxism or socialism or communism openly embrace anarchy, the right is generally seen as an opposing force to these ideologies. And for right-leaning anarchists, there's no such thing as a left-wing anarchist. For them, anarchy simply means following these type of libertarian-style principles, laissez-faire economics, localism, tribalism, following them to their natural ends. But you have to understand that each and every one of these ideologies has been tried before, and it has been pushed across the world by the ruling elite. Anarchy is by no means an exception. And again, when I say each and every one of these ideologies, I mean anarchy, I mean Marxism, socialism, communism, libertarianism, laissez-faire economics, localism, tribalism, all of this stuff has been pushed. So you got to understand that. Now, anarchy and anarchists have been used successfully by agents of international banks, major corporations, intelligence agencies, secret societies. They've been used effectively over the last 2 centuries. Now, I'm not referring necessarily even to anarchist provocateurs like the Black Bloc, but I'm talking about the ideology of anarchy as well as the sort of anarchist movements in general. Not every person that takes part in a color revolution is an agent of the government, by the way, or of a color revolution apparatus, and it's not necessarily even the conscious willingness to participate on the part of the person who is participating, right? The communist revolution is an example of that, as I've been talking about. Many of these people had the best of intentions. They wanted to free themselves from the autocratic rule of the czar, but this is why you got to be street smart. And we can't really go into these lectures length discussions of how anarchist and anarchy have been pushed as an outlet for individuals who are unhappy with the government or government control or oppression or low living standards, etc. We need to talk about the modern anarchist movement of today because we have this same promotion of anarchy from the very halls of a society that would allegedly fall from power if anarchy was ever realized. We can see that big banks, corporations, and even governments in many instances are quite satisfied with the anarchist ideology becoming pervasive in the activist community. And we can also see that they're pushing this ideology because it has an inability, and this is important, anarchy and anarchism has an inability to ever bring about legitimate positive change regardless of whether or not it succeeds. This is the case whether you espouse anarcho-communism, anarcho-capitalism, or any other of the hybrid ideologies and denominations that appear in between. So let's briefly look at the modern anarchist movement. Right? Modern anarchists, regardless of whether or not they're well-meaning, and most of them are, they consistently find themselves on the same side as the ruling elite. Whether you have questions that involve banks, of corporations, of economics, of national infrastructure, privatization, policing, social safety net benefits, wages, the societal structure itself even. Anarchy and anarchism consistently come down on the side of the big banks and of the big corporations and of the robber barons who helped fashion this whole system to begin with. Now, basically, what I'm trying to get at here is anarchy consistently pisses in its own drinking water. Anarchy almost always makes, or anarchism, however you want to say it, almost always makes the outcome of their movements worse than the system that existed before it. Where they don't succeed, they manage to poison legitimate movements with ideas that make the movement unpalatable to the general public, or just completely take the teeth out of any kind of movement that would be taking place. It removes programmatic necessities, removes programmatic demands. In other words, anarchy, even if it doesn't succeed as its own movement, it cripples other movements. Despite the fact that it professes populism and the will of the people, it completely castrates that will and prevents it from ever being put into motion. Now, I'll give an example. Look at the anti-GMO movement as one case in point. The concern over the proliferation of genetically modified food in the American and world, but specifically here, the American food supply, is one that largely unites activists from a variety of political pedigrees. Right? These, whether you're from the left, you're a liberal, whether you're from the right, you're a conservative libertarian, doesn't matter. You don't generally want GMO foods unless you're a complete zombie out there or a trendy little hipster who proudly eats his GMO food. Now, these activists can generally agree that GM food production should be stopped, and generally speaking, these sides can agree that the cease and desist order should come from the state or federal government. But anarchists, they come in and they argue for the opposite. Anarchists come in and they say, no, we can't stop genetically modified food through mandating it from the state or federal government, because that would be legitimizing the state to begin with, and we can't legitimize the state. So who do you think benefits from that? You've got genetically modified food poisoning the environment, destroying human health, and destroying farming in general, and agriculture in general, and doing all kinds of negative things to the infrastructure of the entire country. There's a number of other issues with it as well. All of these things are happening. People can agree we need to stop it, and anarchists come in and say, whoa, no, wait, you can't stop it. You can't stop it. No, don't stop it. Well, who do you think benefits from that? Is it the average person who's having to consume this crap because they can't afford anything else, or because they don't have access to good food? Because the corporations own most of the food supply? No, of course not. Is it the environment that benefits, because now the anarchists have stopped the ban of GMO food, so all these GMO crops are now pervasive in the environment, destroying animals and other and the soil, and creating pesticide-resistant crops and pestilence? No, of course not. The benefits are solely reaped by the major corporations. They're the beneficiaries of the anarchist ideology in terms of genetically modified food is Dow, it's Monsanto, Southern States, these big corporations. And it's the banks that own them. That's who benefits. And of course, ironically, it's the government officials who now don't have to do anything because the little anarchists are out there whining and crying that they don't want to legitimize the state. So now there's lack of pressure on the government officials. They can go ahead and do what they get paid to do, which is pass legislation for the big corporations. Now, the anarchist argument always relies on generally relies on the market, or self-sufficiency, or communitarianism. And to be honest, these are important. These are important solutions. I'm not going to be one of those people that say, "Oh, this is stupid," to go out and plant gardens for yourself and create community gardens and try to make your neighborhood self-sufficiency. Oh, how horrible, how stupid, because it doesn't come from the state. Well, that's the opposite end of the spectrum, right? And we'll deal with that in the future. But it's important to do those things, those little things like trying to become self-sufficient as an individual, and trying to help your community become self-sufficient and grow your own food. So you're pulling out of that corporate system, and that you're doing yourself a service as well. That's not a legitimate solution in terms of national policy. That's in terms of national policy, it's a gimmick. But as an individual, as a community, these things are great. But again, these solutions are important at the individual and grassroots level, but they're not national solutions. They're not practical in terms of national policy or the demands of a movement. But the major international corporations, while they hate home gardens, they hate food sharing, they hate opting away from their products, they're not concerned about these anarchist solutions, because the anarchist solutions are actually beneficial to them. The lack of regulation, the lack of bans on GMO food, the lack of support for family, local, or organic farming, all of this is a tremendous boon to these corporations. They love it. Now, while these anarchists generally mean well, they consistently join movements like the anti-GMO movement. The problem is they tear it apart from within. They poison the well of mass movement and organized demands. The question of reasonable environmental protections, of the regulations of banking, of government ownership of its central bank, of social safety net protections for the elderly or the sick or the disabled, minimum wage laws, other protections, etc. These receive the same response from anarchists as they provide for the anti-GMO movement. In other words, they come in, and no matter how well-meaning they are, the anarchist responds to each and every one of these questions, and it matches up entirely with the position held by large banks, by corporations, and even governments. Now, if you're an anarchist, you consistently find yourself on the same side of the fight as Goldman Sachs, as Monsanto, as BP, and that should tell you something. If you're constantly on the same side as Goldman Sachs, Monsanto, and BP, then you should reevaluate your methods and you should reevaluate your ideology. Any activist that finds themselves consistently on the side of the government should reevaluate their strategy. Any activist that consistently finds themselves on the same side as major banks and corporations should reevaluate their strategy and their ideology. This applies to every activist and not just anarchists. Activists who oppose the evisceration of the social safety net and they promote the implementation of austerity must not allow themselves to be fooled into calling for socialism or communism. In other words, people, the opposite end of the spectrum who see the free market solutions as actually horrible banker-based solutions, you should not allow yourself to be having a knee-jerk reaction either and calling out for this dumb socialism or communism as a solution either, because it's not. Activists who support human rights, you can't allow yourself to be co-opted into believing that your own government works for the benefit of those rights and they become a humanitarian bomber or a responsibility to protect moron. If you're an activist who opposes the systemic abuse of American citizens at the hands of police, you can't allow yourself to become some pathetic social justice warrior that just basically race baits and demands that we have this cultural system of cultural victimization and social class as they want to promote. What you have to do is avoid knee-jerk reactions from the beginning, right? From the activist community in general, you got to stop having these knee-jerk reactions. That never benefits the activist. It never benefits the population that you believe you're fighting for. Simplistic solutions that either spin you off into this never-ending exercise of complaining and griping and bitching, or you require you to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that only castrates your movement. It only makes it susceptible to the control of the ruling elite, and it does that by using your emotions. Whenever you hear someone speaking, and I'm not really responding to somebody like Barack Obama or John Kerry or George Bush or somebody. I'm talking about individuals, researchers, people who are really bringing out information. Then if you hear something that may not fit your left-wing social justice warrior paradigm or your laissez-faire free market libertarian ideology, then instead of becoming emotional, instead of becoming angry and upset and pissed off because somebody has had an idea that's different than yours, perhaps listening and analyzing the claims for where they have merit and where they don't would be a better idea, because you'll benefit more by doing that. You following your own common sense, following your own intuition, your own logic, your own observations, while still being able to manage and organize a mass-scale organization. That's the only hope for any movement that wants to become national or international, at least large enough to have an effect. You can't rely on your emotions, and you can't rely on reactionism, because that's a recipe for failure. If you rely on emotions and your reactions, that is going to be your downfall. You're easily controlled by those things. And that's what you got to have. You got to be able to stop having these knee-jerk reactions. Just use your own brain. You don't need people in the alternative media to think for you. You don't need cliches. You don't need mantras and rhetoric. Just use your brain. You've got one for a reason, and it can benefit you to use it. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time tonight. Next week we're going to talk about geopolitics again, but I really wanted to get this issue kind of off my chest and really wanted to bring this article out and talk about the situation, because I think a lot of people out there need to hear this information. So tonight is March 16th. Thank you for staying with us. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
The Anti-Media Radio with your host Nick Burnby here on UCY.tv.
For more news, visit hitmynews.com.